His boy had not laughed since the fire. The midwife made him laugh on her first day. The fire had taken the barn and the milk cow and most of the winter hay, and, in a way that was harder to name and harder to fix, it had taken something from Caleb Drummond's son. The boy was 7. His name was Eli. Before the fire, he had been the kind of child who talked to chickens and made up songs about the creek, and laughed at things that were not funny to anyone but himself, which is the purest kind of laughter, because it requires no audience. After the fire, he was silent. Not mute, he could speak and occasionally did, in short, flat sentences that answered questions without inviting further conversation, but silent in the way that matters, the interior silence of a child who has seen something that rearranged the furniture of his understanding and left him in a room he does not recognize. The fire had happened in September. It started in the hayloft, cause unknown, and by the time Caleb got the horses out and the water going, the barn was a tower of flame, visible from 3 miles away. Eli had been playing in the yard. He saw the whole thing. He saw the cow that could not be saved. He saw the sparks rise into the September sky like inverted stars. He heard the sounds that a burning barn makes, which are not the sounds that fires make in stories, clean and roaring, but the sounds of wood screaming and nails popping and structure failing, the whole vocabulary of destruction, compressed into 20 minutes of heat and noise, and the smell of everything you own turning to smoke. Caleb had rebuilt the barn by November, working alone because the neighbors helped for 2 days, and then went back to their own problems, and 2 days was not enough. He rebuilt it with pine from the ridge and nails from town, and the grim, mechanical energy of a man who fixes things, because fixing things is the only language of grief he knows. He could not rebuild his son. He did not know how. He had tried. He had taken the boy fishing at the creek where they used to go on Saturdays, and Eli sat on the bank and held the pole and stared at the water without interest, as though the fish and the creek and the whole apparatus of a Saturday outing belonged to a life that was no longer his. Caleb had tried reading to him at night, the way Margaret used to, but the books were Margaret's books, and the voice was not Margaret's voice, and the reading felt like a performance of something that had been real and was now a copy. Margaret, Eli's mother, had died of scarlet fever when the boy was 3, and Margaret had been the one who understood the interior workings of a child, the fears and the feelings, and the tangled architecture of a small person's heart. Caleb understood livestock and lumber and the weather and the way a fence post sits in the ground, and none of those things were useful when his son sat at the supper table and stared at his plate and did not speak. The midwife arrived in January. Her name was Nettie Chalfont. She was 30, strong-shouldered, with freckled arms and a wide, practical face, and the kind of energy that enters a room slightly before the person carrying it, so that you feel her coming the way you feel a change in weather, a shift in pressure, a brightening. She had come to the valley to replace old Mrs. Birch, who had been delivering babies in the Elk Bend region of Montana for 40 years, and whose hands had finally surrendered to the arthritis that had been stalking them for a decade. Nettie had trained in Portland under a physician who believed that midwifery was a profession and not merely a tradition, and she had come to Elk Bend because she wanted to work where the need was real, and the distances were long, and the women who needed her could not easily get to a doctor. She carried her own instruments in a leather bag that she kept cleaner than most people kept their kitchens. Nettie needed a place to stay until she could find permanent lodging. The town sent her to Caleb's ranch because Caleb had a spare room that had been empty since Margaret died, and because the town, in the way that small towns manage the lives of their residents with cheerful efficiency, had decided that a widower with a silent child could use a woman in the house, even if the woman was only renting a room. Caleb met her at the door with the expression of a man who has agreed to something he is not sure about and is already composing the speech he will give when it does not work out. He was 33, lean and weathered, with the calloused hands and the permanent squint of a man who works outside in all conditions. He was not unfriendly. He was civil and competent and reliable, but he was guarded, in the way that people who have lost too much become guarded, not against the world but against hope, which is the thing that makes losing hurt. Mrs. Chalfont. Miss. I have never been married, and you can call me Nettie. Because Mrs. Birch told me that formality in a valley this small is a waste of breath. All right, Nettie. The room is at the end of the hall. Supper is at 6. The boy is quiet. Quiet how? Quiet in every way there is. Eli was sitting at the kitchen table when Nettie came in with her bags. He looked up at her with the flat, assessing gaze of a child who has learned to expect nothing from new arrivals and is rarely disappointed. He was small for 7, with brown hair that needed cutting, and his father's squint and his mother's mouth, though he did not know that, because he did not remember his mother's mouth. Nettie set down her bags. She looked at Eli. She did not crouch down to his level, which is what most adults do when they want to seem approachable, and which most children recognize as a performance. She stood at her full height and looked at him directly and said, "I just came from Mrs. Birch's house, and Mrs. Birch has a cat that is so fat it cannot fit through the cat door. It has to go around to the front and knock." Eli stared at her. "She says the cat knocks with its paw." I did not believe her until I saw it happen. 3 knocks, very polite, and then the cat sits and waits like a gentleman calling on a lady. Eli's mouth moved. It was not a smile. Not yet, but it was the precursor to a smile. The geological shift that happens beneath the surface before the surface changes. "Does the cat really knock?" he asked. It was the first question he had asked anyone in 4 months. 3 times. Every time. If you do not answer fast enough, he knocks again. And there, in the kitchen of a ranch house in Elk Bend, Montana, on a January afternoon, with snow on the ground, and the rebuilt barn standing raw and new outside the window, the smell of fresh pine still in it, Eli Drummond made a sound that his father had not heard since September. It was not a full laugh. It was a small, involuntary exhalation, half surprise and half delight, the sound of something that had been locked breaking open. It lasted less than a second. It was the most significant sound Caleb had heard in his life. He was standing in the doorway. He heard it. He did not move. He did not speak. He stood with his hand on the doorframe and felt something in his chest that he had forgotten the shape of. Not joy exactly, but the possibility of joy, which is the thing that comes before joy, the way dawn comes before morning. Nettie stayed. She stayed in the room at the end of the hall, and she went out to deliver babies, 2 in January, 1 in February, 3 in March, and 1 difficult breach in early April that kept her away for 2 days. And she came home to the ranch each evening and sat at the supper table with Caleb and Eli, and the table that had been silent began to have sound. She did not try to fix Eli. She did not sit him down and ask about the fire, or tell him that feelings were important, or perform any of the well-meaning interventions that adults inflict on children who are suffering. She simply existed in his vicinity, with a warmth and humor that was as natural to her as breathing, and that was not directed at his pain but at his personhood, telling him stories about the babies she delivered, about the fat cat at Mrs. Birch's house, about her childhood in Portland, about the time she accidentally dropped a bag of flour in a creek and created what she called a flour river, and what the fish presumably called a disaster. The stories worked, not immediately, not completely, but in the slow accumulative way that warmth works on ice, 1 degree at a time, invisible, until suddenly the ice is water, and you cannot identify the moment it changed. Eli began to talk at meals, first in single sentences, and then in the rolling, circuitous monologues that are a child's natural mode of communication when the world feels safe enough to speak in. He began to ask questions about the babies Nettie delivered, about the herbs in her bag, about the cat, and whether it had learned to open doors yet. He began, tentatively and then with increasing confidence, to return to the boy he had been before the fire. Not the same boy, because experience does not allow that, but a version of that boy who had been through something terrible and survived it, and was learning that survival does not require silence. Caleb watched. He watched the way a man watches a drought break, with gratitude so deep it is almost indistinguishable from grief, because the relief reveals how bad the drought was, and the revelation is its own kind of pain. He watched Nettie tell Eli about the knocking cat. He watched Eli help Nettie carry her medical bag to the wagon when she went on calls. the boy insisting on lifting the heavy bag with both arms, and refusing help with the particular stubbornness of a child who is trying to be useful to someone he loves. He watched Nettie thank the boy each time with the same seriousness she would give to an adult, never diminishing the effort, never treating it as cute. He watched the two of them in the garden that Nettie planted in April, Eli digging holes and Nettie dropping seeds, and both of them talking about what would grow and when and how tall. He fell in love with her on a Tuesday in May, though he suspected the falling had been happening for weeks before he noticed, the way a creek rises gradually during snowmelt, until one morning it overflows the bank, and you realize the water has been rising all along. He knew the day, because he was mending fence on the south pasture when it happened, and the specificity of the location anchored the feeling in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. He was mending fence on a warm afternoon with the meadowlarks singing in the tall grass, and he was thinking about Nettie, and he realized that the thinking had changed. It was no longer the thinking of a man who is grateful to a boarder, but the thinking of a man who cannot imagine the house without her in it. And the shift between those two kinds of thinking was the shift between appreciation and love. And it happened on a Tuesday in May on the south pasture, while he was holding a fence staple in his teeth. He did not tell her immediately. He was not a man who said things immediately. He was a man who thought about things for a long time, and then said them once, correctly, the way he set a fence post. Measure twice, dig once, make sure it holds. The fence posts on his south pasture had been standing for 8 years without leaning, and he intended his words to hold at least as long. He told her in June, on the porch, after Eli had gone to bed. The evening was warm, and the sky was the particular blue that Montana skies achieve in summer, a blue so deep it looks like it goes on forever, which it does. The crickets had started their evening chorus, and the horses were quiet in the corral, and the rebuilt barn stood against the sky, like a promise that things destroyed could be remade. "I need to say something," he said. "All right. You came here to rent a room. I am aware of that, but the room is not what I want to offer you anymore." Nettie looked at him. She looked at him with the direct, practical gaze that she brought to everything. Deliveries, conversations, fat cats, everything. "What do you want to offer me?" "Everything else. The house, the ranch, Eli, myself, all of it." "Caleb Drummond, are you proposing to me on this porch?" "I am. Badly, probably. Not badly, directly. Which is better than badly." She paused. The evening settled around them. A horse shifted in the corral. Yes. Eli, who was supposed to be in bed, appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt and said, "Does this mean Nettie stays?" "It means Nettie stays," Caleb said. He looked at Nettie. She looked at Eli. The three of them stood in the doorway of the ranch house. The man, the midwife, and the boy in his nightshirt, and the moment held them like a photograph before anyone moved. And Eli laughed, not the small, involuntary exhalation of January, but a real laugh, full and free, and startled out of him by happiness. The kind of laugh that a 7-year-old makes when the world, which has been wrong for a long time, suddenly becomes right. It was the sound of a door opening in a room that had been shut since September, and the light that came through it was strong enough to fill the whole house. They married in July in the yard of the ranch, with the rebuilt barn behind them, and the garden growing, and the Montana sky doing its best impression of forever overhead. Nettie wore wildflowers in her hair because she said that purchased flowers were an insult to a valley that grew its own, and the valley had grown an abundance of lupine and Indian paintbrush and wild columbine that year, as though the land itself had opinions about decoration and wanted to contribute. Eli stood between them and held both their hands. The midwife and the rancher and the boy who had not laughed since the fire made a family in the yard of a house that had been too quiet for too long, and the silence that had lived there packed its bags and left without ceremony, replaced by the sound of a woman telling stories about a fat cat and a boy laughing at them, and a man standing in the doorway with his shoulder against the frame and his arms crossed, and a look on his face that was not quite a smile, but was the closest thing to one that Caleb Drummond had managed in a very long time, learning that the sounds a house makes when it is full are the opposite of the sounds a barn makes when it is burning, and infinitely better.